Welcome to the Grove Church. My name is Kent, and thank you for being here today. You can find all these videos and more on our website or by visiting our YouTube page. As always, you can give right on our website to support what God is doing through the Grove Church as we help all people experience new life in Jesus. It's a great way to give back to God what He has so generously given all of us. So thank you. Well, today we are going to continue in our series, Genesis, in the beginning. In this series, we will trace out the story of the gospel from where it all began in Genesis. Yes, it began all the way back in Genesis. And to know who we are to be today, we must know our story. And our story is the gospel story. We will be opening up to Genesis chapter 6, so grab your phone or follow along with your Bible in front of you. Now, so far in Genesis, God has been shown creating and bringing order and function into the earth from a chaotic state. And as we continue in the story, the book of Genesis will see how humanity rebels against God's divine authority and God's subsequent unfolding plan to restore creation and humanity to its original purposes by grace through faith. We will see here in Genesis chapter 6 through 9 that God is our Redeemer. We can trust and put our confidence in Him and His promises. Now, today we will be tracing Noah's story that is a beautiful picture of what the gospel is, that we are to live out as we see two ways that God is going to be pictured here. So let's jump into our story now. It starts in Genesis chapter 6, verse 9. Look at these verses. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. More on those guys later. But Noah was seen here as blameless in his generation. I love that statement. Noah walked with God. Essentially, with this statement, we are left wondering if Noah could be the offspring of Eve to bring about the crushing defeat of the serpent. As we move through Noah's story, we will see many allusions to the first three chapters of Genesis. And just before these verses, Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 8 indicate how serious the situation on earth had become in Noah's day. God saw the wickedness of the hearts of man and woman and their inclination to continually sin. This grieves God's heart. Why was this the case? As we see in verse 11, the earth was filled with violence, and in verse 12, all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. The story of creation has reached such a low point that God decides to cleanse the world by destroying the world, and with it, the human race, through a great flood. God will start afresh through a man named Noah and his family. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Now, this story is not included to give a reason why God had the right to destroy the earth. Rather, it was an explanation of why God spared Noah. Now, in Genesis 6, 13 through 22, God gives Noah instructions on how to construct the ark and who the occupants of the ark will be, including some specific animals. Now, Noah, his extended family, and these animals will be delivered from the coming judgment because God brings salvation not just to humans, but to all of His creation. Now, it's interesting how these verses are actually used later in the Bible in 2 Peter chapter 2. Now, see, in Peter's time, he talks about the flood and Noah as a preacher, and he's speaking to the fact that there's these false teachers that exist in his time, and they have these ungodly lives that aren't being punished by divine judgment. But he's signaling that that should not be taken to mean that God does not judge such people. He actually uses some very specific examples of God's judgment from the Old Testament to prove this. And one of those is verse 5 of chapter 2. Just check it out. If He did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when He brought a flood upon the whole world of the ungodly. The focus here is that God does in fact judge the lives of the ungodly. However, here in 2 Peter, it mentions that Noah was a herald of righteousness. Now, this heralding, this preaching, could be taken one of two ways. The first is, just like how Genesis, the account says, Noah was a righteous man. This would be in reference to the way he lived his life. It was as if he was preaching righteousness by the way he lived. The second option is Noah could have been actually preaching those 100 years it took him to build the boat. You could imagine how Noah would have been asked what he's doing out there building this boat. Now, as a preacher, I really like the second option, but maybe it's just fitting to me. But the first option is very compelling as well. Ultimately, I do believe it's both of these, yet I lean a little bit more towards the latter option. I understand 2 Peter to be saying that Noah's message would have been one of calling others toward righteous living. This would fly right in the face of the culture in Noah's time and the beliefs of those around him. I'm sure you all have felt alone in standing up for something that you believed in. And here's the amazing thing about Noah. And it's not just that God asked him to stand up for him. Noah does it without complaint or argument, nowhere. Now, you might think, of course, who would question God? Well, wait until later. It seems everyone in the Old Testament ends up questioning God, especially Abraham, who God is going to do amazing things through. Look how the Bible sums up Noah's response in verse 22. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. That is the whole description that the Bible gives us of the actual 100 years it took Noah to build the ark. He just did it because God said so. We could get really fixated on the process of how he actually built the ark, but the Bible doesn't, so we shouldn't either. So let's discuss this question together now. When have you stepped out in faith last? How did you handle the desire to complain? After Noah and his family and the animals enter the ark, God sends huge amounts of water upon the earth. Just check out verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month of the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heavens were opened, and rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, Noah is about to experience God's grace. However, he must go through the judgment along with everyone else. How will he make it through? How can he survive with this remnant with him? Well, it's through God's provision of the ark. God provides a way through the waters. Here's the first reason we can place our confidence in God and his promises today. God is a holy judge and a gracious redeemer. See, Genesis 7:23 describes the righteous judgment of God. He says this: he blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left and those who were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. Now, many question why God would judge humanity like this and all of the world. I think we first need to understand that humanity's state grieved God's heart. He was not gleeful or excited to bring this judgment. And some people have in their minds that God somehow is pleased with destroying the earth and human life. This is just flat out not true. Secondly, God must punish sin. If there is to be a relationship between him and his creation, he must punish sin. See, God is just and holy. There must be a payment made to take away his judgment. This may not make complete sense to us. However, here we have to understand that God is set apart from us. He's holy. Our ways are not his ways. Our thoughts are not his thoughts. Well, the third thing we need to understand is there can be no deliverance from the judgment waters without the very judgment waters. Judgment of sin is what makes grace possible. Surviving the judgment itself is what distinguishes Noah and the others from the rest of creation. Noah experiences new life through judgment as he becomes a remnant to God. The picture that is being painted here that Noah is a righteous and faithful remnant, a survivor of God's judgment. This will be a theme picked up heavily upon and the major prophets later in the Old Testament. God is a holy judge and a gracious redeemer to Noah right here. Even as God rains down his judgment on his children, he graciously provides a way out of judgment through a wooden ark to give life and flourishing to his people. Noah would never have experienced God's intended grace if there had been no judgment. Likewise, one day God would rain down his judgment on his son, hanging on a wooden cross that would provide life and flourishing for all his children who place their trust and faith in him alone. God is a holy judge and a gracious redeemer. He can be trusted to right all wrongs and forgive all trespasses. All of us have been wronged and hurt in the past. We've experienced some form of injustice. Some make it seem that Christianity is all about just letting go and forgiving, that we somehow look past injustice and let it go. And for sure, we extend forgiveness, yet we understand that one day God will lay all our works bare, good or evil, and will judge them, exacting a penalty on those responsible. He is a holy judge that will not let things go unpunished. Now, that may freak some of you out today. However, God is also a gracious redeemer. These are two heads of the same coin. He's provided a way for you to be spared from the wrath that is to come. Let's check out Romans 3:23 and what it says. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness because in his divine forbearance, he passed over former sins. Jesus on the cross is the propitiation for our sin. This word propitiation carries the idea of wiping away of sin or expiation. However, the word cannot be restricted to the wiping away of sin alone, as it also refers to the satisfaction or appeasement of God's wrath, his judgment. It's turning his wrath into favor for the person who believes. God is a holy and just God, that he's made a payment for our injustice to spare us from the wrath to come. But for those who don't receive it, there's a day coming where he will exact that wrath upon them. Let's discuss this question together. How have you experienced injustice? How have you dealt with that injustice? So how does the story end? Well, check out verse 1 of chapter 8. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made the wind blow on the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed, and the rain from the heavens was restrained. And the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated, and in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month, and in the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. Here, God's grace and redemption are further evidenced when, after these many months, the floodwaters recede. You'd think that it was a long cruise and everyone wanted to hurry off the ark, but not Noah. He waits. Check out verse 13 to 15. In the 601st year, in the 1st month of the 1st day, the waters were dried from the earth, and Noah removed the coverings of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. In the 2nd month of the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. Then God said to Noah, "Go out from the ark." Noah here waits until God gives him directions before leaving the boat. Again, Noah is so obedient, far more than I would be, or possibly even you'd be. Remember, Noah has been on this boat for months. All I've ever done is a 3-day cruise, and I couldn't wait to get off that boat. And Noah's on no cruise ship, okay? Noah is also, by this time, knows that there was dry land. He had just sent out birds in the previous verses and discovered that things had been growing again. Plus, one of the birds doesn't come back, which is a telltale sign that land is around. See, this is an emphasis on Noah's obedience. Again, we should all be asking, could he be the one? But the story continues. God instructs Noah and his family with all the animals to come out of the ark. Noah immediately builds an altar to God and makes sacrifices. God then, in turn, makes several promises to Noah in the form of a covenant. God is undoing part of the curse of Adam from chapter 3. Maybe Noah is the seed that will beat the evil forces and restore God's good creation to its original purpose and intent. Because of Noah's obedience, God is going to shed his grace commonly on all creation. This is what some theologians have actually come to call common grace. Common grace is the concept that God has always bestowed his graciousness on all people in all parts of the earth at all times, even if they don't follow him or believe in him. That is what is being alluded to with verse 22. This is not a conditional promise by God, but a universal one. Here we see the second characteristic of God. God is a faithful promise keeper. We see this in the fact that God has just now promised something that all of us have experienced for our whole life. Even here in Bakersfield, we have the change of seasons. At the end of God's covenant to Noah, he extends the promise to all of Noah's descendants and the whole of creation. And as a sign of God's gracious covenant, the rainbow is given to be a reminder of the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God is faithful, and we can put our confidence in the promises of God. We have to remember it. God longs for us to remember. That's why we get the rainbow. So let's discuss this question together now. How do you attempt to remind yourself of God's grace in your life? And at this point, you may be wonder, is the story done? Well, no, it's not. To the conclusion now, verse 20. Noah began to be a man of the soil. Interesting. And he planted a vineyard. This is meant to bring us back to Genesis 2. Noah's like Adam, as God has started all over with him in a new world that has emerged from the chaotic waters. Here we have an Adam-like character planting his own garden-like place, not going in a good direction, because in chapter 2, God planted the garden. Now man is planting his own garden. What happens next? Well, verse 21 says, he drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. We see here Genesis 3 is on repeat. Noah is in a garden-like place and he partakes in a fruit, then finds himself naked and shamed. His son tells his other brothers that his father's naked. This ends up resulting in Ham receiving a curse. We see in the end that Noah couldn't obey God perfectly. He sins right here by getting drunk to the point of passing out. He's just like Adam, naked, shamed, and cursed. Noah was not the one to bring about salvation to God's good creation. There's still yet one to come to bring a redemption, forgiveness, and ultimate deliverance from the scourge of sin and death. Jesus will be this second Adam. He not only is obedient, but perfectly obedient. He lived a life we could not live, that Noah couldn't live. He died the death we all deserved because of God's judgment and wrath. Now, where Noah failed, Jesus did not fail. Too often we read the stories of the Old Testament and we think we have to become more obedient and try harder because it's about being moral. However, that is not true with God. The Old Testament is constantly showing us how we fail to live up to God's standards, to live His way. Even Noah, who is spared, again, spared from the deluge, right? Because he was a righteous dude, fails in the end. That is why Jesus had to come in the flesh, live the life you couldn't live, dying the death you deserved, because you and I are incapable of doing it. We're incapable of paying for our sin. God had to do it himself. I could not think of a more gracious way for God to reinforce his truth than through the life and failure of Noah. Noah is no better than any of those who died in the flood. Not at all. But God is supremely gracious still. God is our Redeemer. We can put our confidence in him and in his promises. Today, we saw God pictured as a holy judge and Redeemer, who's a faithful promise keeper. He will keep his promises to 1,000 generations. And he's done this for us in Jesus. How are you going to allow God's grace to affect your week ahead? Remember, this is our story. It's a story of failure. It's a story of redemption. It's a story of faith. Will you put your faith in Jesus? Will you follow hard after him this week? I want to encourage you to look to Jesus alone for all of your trouble, for all of your failure, for all of your pain, because he has bore it on his body on the cross. Well, thank you for joining us today, and we will see you next week as we continue in Genesis.